Welcome to my 227th video on my work with 00 gauge. This will be a kit build video, specifically of Metcalfe card kit PO286 for a ramshackle warehouse. This will be a fairly long one with a lot of detail, so mainly of interest to folks considering building this kit themselves. I was a bit shocked to realise when I checked that this is the first kit build of a Metcalfe card building that I've done for nearly 2 years. The last one was the single-road engine shed for my 2-rail Hornby layout back in October 2021. I have done some Metcalfe mini kits since that for clocks, benches, kiosks, etc., and I've done some super quick buildings. So far as I know, this is Metcalfe's most recent kit release. It came out just last year, 2022. And honestly, I bought it more because of interest in the kit than because I really needed this building for any of my layouts. My first attempt to buy it actually failed, as the stock at British Model Trains, my local dealer and the largest dealer of Metcalfe kits in North America, sold out before I got my order in. Here's the picture of the building from the packaging. When I first saw pictures of this building online, the exterior steps were more chunky looking and brown in colour. I actually preferred that look, but I'm not sure if Metcalfe ever actually shipped the kit like that. The green steps, as seen here, seem to be what you actually get now. I went to the Metcalfe website as I wanted to determine the footprint of the finished building. The page is shown here with the Downloads tab selected. What I wanted was the lower item, the footprint PDF. If you print that PDF in its original size without any scaling during the print, you'll get a page like this, which is the actual size of the footprint of the building. The PDF actually has a colour image, but I printed it in grayscale. I used a sharp knife and steel rulers to carefully cut out the footprint image. And then I tried it in a couple of places. It seemed that the building might fit okay as shown here behind the station on my 003 rail tabletop. I always struggle a bit these days to open Metcalfe packaging, as no obvious means of opening is provided. Sometimes I slit the top of the packaging with a sharp knife, but that makes me a bit nervous, as it would be easy to damage the contents that way. This time I was able to pry the top flap up, although rather messily so, as you can see. There was a time when Metcalfe provided perforations to assist with the opening, I seem to recall. The way this kit came packed was sort of interesting. There was a sprue of green plastic parts for the exterior steps, and the card sheets were specially set up to allow that plastic sprue to fit in between, with everything sitting flat. Here you can see the plastic sprue showing through a card sheet. The little round bit at top centre is what actually attaches the plastic sprue to the card sheet. Here's the other side of that sheet showing the sprue attached. To make space for the plastic sprue and keep things flat, one of the card sheets of printed parts has a piece separated and folded back, leaving a gap. Here are all of the kit contents: 2 folded sheets of printed card parts, so 4 A4 sheets total, 1 sheet of grey heavy card parts, a sheet of clear acetate glazing parts, a small sprue of plastic parts, and instructions in the form of a colour booklet. Printed card sheet B comes folded round in this odd way to provide the compartment for the plastic sprue. Here's sheet B laid out flat with the separate section opened out in the middle at the top here. And here's sheet A, the other sheet of printed card parts. These parts follow the standard Metcalfe format, which I generally find the best of all the different makes of card kits. The sheets are very well printed, with good separation between the parts, no ambiguity as to where one part ends and another begins, as can often be the case, for example, with super quick kits. The lines where you need to cut to extract the parts from the sheets are clearly marked, although Metcalfe do generally seem to manage to forget to do that marking in at least one place on most kits. Here's what I mostly use to assemble these kits: rocket card glue with a nice thin nozzle dispenser, and a sharp hobby knife with a new blade fitted. Q-tips are handy for removing excess glue, etc. Tweezers and steel rulers also often come in handy. Here's the first page of the instructions with keys to the sheets and various suggestions, read tools, etc. Metcalfe always include in the instructions this note about removing all of the parts from the sheets and putting them into a builder's yard, and I never do it, as it seems to me it would just be unnecessarily confusing and would take up a lot of space needlessly. Mostly I just take parts out of the sheets when I'm ready to use them, although there are some exceptions to that for pre-assembly, etc. I separated the plastic sprue from the sheet of heavy card parts. I wasn't too clear how I was supposed to do this, but I found that I was able to just push out the retaining pin from the back of the sheet. Here's the sheet of clear acetate glazing parts. I like the way that Metcalfe do these, with decent borders round each part. The instructions suggest starting by fitting all of the clear glazing parts to their corresponding card frames, and I did do this. You can see most of the card window frames here as they come on sheet A. Here are most of the window frames separated from the sheet. And here they are with their apertures opened. Mostly the aperture pieces will just pop out when pushed, but you do need to be a bit careful and help with a knife if they resist, as it's easy to get wispy bits of card left if you tear things, and you don't want that. Here are the frames and the clear parts. The DF parts are for doors, but I was initially puzzled as to what WF6 was for, as there was no corresponding frame for that part. I cut out all of the acetate parts. In this case I did this with a steel ruler and a sharp knife, although I sometimes use scissors, as the acetate is a bit tough to cut with a knife. And here are all of the window frames with their glazing glued in place. Metcalfe kits generally make it quite easy to do this, providing ample borders to the clear parts, so they can be glued without marking the visible surface. Here is the instructions section dealing with glazing for the doors. I have to say, to me, this seemed needlessly confusing. 1 goes with 1A, 2 goes with 1, and 3 goes with 4. It's obvious! Why didn't they just make the labels match? I expect they printed the sheets wrongly by mistake and just tried to fix it with the instructions like this. Here are most of those door parts on sheet B with the corresponding glazing parts. And here are all of the door parts cut out. And here I've sorted out which glazing parts go with which door as per the instructions. I glued the glazing parts to the back of the doors. When gluing glazing parts, you always want to be looking at the outside so you can get the printing on the glazing properly centered in the aperture in the card. Glue does tend to spread when you push the parts into place, so you need to use as little glue as possible and to place it away from the surface that will be visible. Here are those doors from the outside. I assembled both options for the larger doors, as I didn't know at this point which option I might want to use. The next instruction deals with glazing for the roof windows. These instructions also clear up the mystery of what WF6 is for. It goes with one of the optional bricked-up doorway parts. I have to wonder why the glazing parts for the roof windows were made oversized, requiring trimming after fitting. I suspect this was just another error in the printing up of the parts sheets. Here are those roof glazing parts as they come on the acetate sheet. So you have to cut neatly across the bottom of the parts with no line to guide you. I did this with a steel ruler and a sharp knife, and it was pretty fiddly getting it exact. Here are the roof glazing parts together with their corresponding card frames. Here you can see how I glued the glazing to the card. As I said before, I can't see any sensible reason why the glazing parts were made too big for the frames. And in hindsight, I think it would have been easier to cut them down to size before gluing them to the card parts rather than afterwards, as indicated by the instructions. Here you can see those assemblies from the outside with the clear parts protruding on either side. The instructions suggest putting these parts aside to let the glue fully dry before trying to trim the acetate, which I did, although as I say, this whole process seemed kind of pointless to me. I mean, you have to do it now because the parts are oversized, but I can't see why they made them oversized. Whilst those parts were drying, I cut out the parts for the bricked-up doorways and fitted glazing part WF6. I didn't end up actually using these parts, as they really only apply if you don't want to attach the side building. Since there's no printing on the sheet of heavy card parts, the instructions provide a key to those parts on the first page. I penciled the part numbers onto the sheet. Next, I got back to trimming the excess acetate from the roof windows, an annoyingly fiddly process, as it was difficult to cut the tough acetate flush with the edge without damaging the card. Here are the roof window parts after that trimming. After those preparatory steps, assembly moves on to the main building, starting with the walls for the main building seen here. This is the largest single part in this kit and the only part that spanned across the fold of the sheet it came on. Here's that part with all of the window and door apertures cleared. I sorted out the appropriate windows to fit to these walls as indicated by the instructions. Except in the case of a couple of odd bits of weirdness or error that I note as I'm going along, the instructions were generally very clear and well laid out. I glued those windows into place. As noted, I always look from this side when fitting the windows so that I can centre them properly. Here's the view from the back. You can see how I applied glue to the parts, although it spreads a lot as the parts are pressed in place. You need to get the parts centred pretty quickly, as the glue doesn't take long to bite. Next up was the assembly of the main building floor from 2 heavy card parts and 1 printed part. Here are those 3 parts taken out of their sheets. And here they are assembled, lined up as best as I could manage. Again, you have to work quickly lining up the parts before the glue sets, so they can't be moved anymore. Here are the instructions regarding fitting that floor. When gluing things at ground level, I work on a piece of scrap foam board to avoid getting glue on my cutting mat. The foam board also provides a better level surface for aligning things. I tried the floor in place before applying glue. Getting the bits to fit through the door openings was a bit fiddly. And here's the floor glued in place. As you can see, I put glue along too much of one of the walls. Next, doors need to be assembled and fitted to the openings in the walls. Here are the parts for those doors. I glued the doors to the back of their frames. I got confused and put glue onto the front of one of the frames rather than the door in one case. Here is the large door glued in place. This was one of the 2 options. I thought this option would look best. And here's the small door glued in place. Next, an upper floor needs to be fitted to those walls. And here's that part taken out of the heavy card sheet. And here it is fitted, with the steps fitting through the upper door openings and the tab supporting the free side. Now the upper doors are fitted. The bricked-up door on the side only needs to be fitted if the side building is to be omitted, and I wanted to include the side building. I glued the upper door to the back of its frame, and then I glued it in place in the opening. Now the walls need to be finished off by folding them round the floors and fixing them. This was a bit tricky. It wasn't easy to make a perfect join where the ends of the walls butted together, as seen here. I helped this process by gluing a piece of card from one of the window openings to the inside of the butt join at the top, making this join more secure. So there's the main building structure mostly complete. Next, I glued those gable reinforcement pieces to the inside of the walls at either end. Tricky to get them aligned exactly. I got a bit confused by these instructions. I was searching for these ridge beam parts and couldn't find them on sheet A or sheet B. They were actually heavy card parts from that sheet. Here are those parts cut from that sheet. These parts were pretty resistant to being folded over. It isn't easy to fold a heavy card. I glued them double and held them firmly down until the glue set. Then I glued the two sides together, making the beam. This beam then sits across, protruding from the wall at the front, presumably with the intention of supporting a lift to bring materials up to the upper doors. The instructions say not to glue the beam at the end that protrudes. I don't quite know why, perhaps to allow more flexibility in fitting the roof. The main roof is the next part to be dealt with. Here is the printed card part for the main roof. The tabs need to be pressed out, but pivoted, not completely taken out. And then they're folded back and glued inside. Those tabs then help in positioning the roof against the end walls. Next, the roof windows need to be fitted. Here are the parts for those windows. The windows need to be carefully aligned with the holes in the roof. The ridge part folds to go over the top, and the two other pieces are separated. Here I've fitted those parts in place. I did use a black marker on the top part as the edges really showed up. I blotched the marker a little bit, but I don't think it will be very noticeable. With the main building essentially completed, assembly moves on to the two additions, the side building and the boiler house. Here are the parts for the side building walls. The two windows are glued in place, and the card support is glued flush at side and bottom. Next, an upper floor and a door need to be fitted. I located the part for the floor. This is a printed part, not a heavy card part. And I fitted it resting on the support and through the door opening. Here are the parts for the side building door. The door is glued to the back of its frame. Then the assembly is glued behind the door opening. Next, the side building needs to be attached to the main building and finished off with a roof and an exterior platform. Here are the parts for the roof and the platform. The side building glues to the side of the main building with the walls lined up at the end. This hides the opening where we otherwise might have fitted the bricked-up doorway. The roof is glued onto the top of the side building. Then the exterior platform is glued to the tab protruding from the door. This was fiddly since it was hard to get at in the corner, and I used tweezers with the building sitting on its side. Here's that platform in place. I did glue the side of the folded down section to the wall. Next, assembly moves on to the other add-on, the boiler house. Here are the main parts for the boiler house. The apertures of these parts are cleared by pressing out the pieces. The two frames are glued inside the walls with the edges flush. Since the inner and outer apertures are lined up, the frames didn't really seem to do much. Here are the rest of the boiler house parts on sheet B. I got the floor part out from the sheet and fitted it to the walls with the tabs through the openings. Next, the doors need to be fitted. Here are those doors. And here they are glued in place. I guess the frames just give more thickness to the walls. Here's that assembly from the inside. I used pencil and marker to colour the edges of the card a bit. Next, the boiler house will be fitted to the side of the main building. a heavy card guide piece will support it. Here is that heavy card guide piece. The tab is folded over and glued double. This will then support the boiler house floor. There was no marking to indicate where the card support should go on the side wall, so I assumed it was supposed to be centered, and did my best to do that. This did pretty much hide the join in the main walls. The boiler house walls were then glued in place, with the floor resting on the tab of the heavy card part. Next, the back wall of the boiler house needs to be fitted. I keep a thin needle on hand as the nozzle of the glue gets constantly clogged up and needs to be opened up. The thread on the needle is just to make the needle easier to find on the bench. I glued the back wall of the boiler house in place. It didn't really fit quite right, as it seemed that the heavy card support was a bit wider than the floor, resulting in a gap between the floor and the wall at the back on the inside, but I don't think this is going to be noticeable when the building's finished. Next, the boiler house roof needs to be fitted. Before the roof is fitted, its window is glued in place. Here is the roof with the window in place. I'm a bit unclear as to why these windows have no frame at the bottom. Do windows in real life just have glass at the bottom with nothing supporting it? I lined that window up by looking at it from the inside as I glued it. Then the roof was fitted over the boiler house. The roof needs to line up exactly with the walls in the corner where that gap is, as the chimney will go there. And the chimney is the next thing to be dealt with. Here are the chimney parts on sheet B. These are the parts for the lower section of the chimney. The main chimney part is folded so that the boundaries of the sections are clear from the inside. Then the inner supports are glued in place, flush at the bottom, with one of the supports overlapping the end. Then the chimney is folded round and the butted wall glued to the inner support. As suggested by the instructions, I used clips to hold the chimney in place until the glue set, although the instructions suggested using clothes pegs, which I don't think would actually have fitted inside the chimney. The square part is then glued into the top of that chimney section. I had to force it a bit to get it in, but once in it holds the chimney square. Next, that chimney section needs to be capped off. Here are the two cap parts for that. The two cap parts are glued together and then they're fixed on top of the chimney section, trying to keep everything centered as best as possible. Next, the upper section of the chimney needs to be done. Here are the parts for that. Similarly to the lower section, the walls are folded and then the inner supports are glued in place, with one overlapping the end of the wall. In this case, the inner supports are fitted flush with the top rather than flush with the bottom. The walls fold round and glue to the inner support. Again, I held things in place with clips until the glue dried. Then a square former was fitted, this time into the bottom of the section. Here are the two sections of the chimney after assembly. Framing pieces will go onto the top of the chimney. Here are those pieces on the sheet. I glued them to the top of the chimney, lined up as best as I could. I didn't want pink and grey card showing inside the chimney, so I used some black paint on the inside at the top. Next, the two sections of the chimney need to be fitted together. And here I have done that. The butt joins are lined up together on the same side. The instructions suggest perhaps fitting a piece of wire to the chimney as a lightning rod to hide the otherwise rather obvious butt join in the walls. I cut a piece of the thinnest piano wire that I had on hand for this purpose. I also cut a notch in the capstone to allow the rod to fit flush. and I glued that rod to the upper chimney section along the join in the walls, using card glue. At this point, the main assembly was basically done. Here's the picture from the instructions. Nice to have full colour instructions. And here's my own model at this point. Next, exterior steps need to be fitted. Card steps for the boiler house and plastic steps to the upper door of the side building. Here are the instructions re the boiler house steps. The instructions suggest assembling the heavy card pieces for the boiler house steps directly one at a time against the wall. Here are the heavy card pieces for those steps. There are 2 pieces of each size, making each step double thickness. It seemed to me it would be unnecessarily fiddly to try to assemble these against the wall, so I just glued them together separately. I started by gluing each of the doubled steps together. Then I glued all of the steps on top of each other, pressing them down on the mat to line them up. Then I glued the whole assembly in place in the corner of the wall under the step coming out of the door. Next, there are walls to go outside those steps. Here are the remaining parts for those steps, the walls and the capstones. I couldn't really see why the outer wall was made with a full-length end section that needed to be cut off. Another mistake, perhaps? In any case, I did as the instructions indicated, glued the inner wall, the spacer, and the outer wall together, folded the end section round and glued it to the end, and then cut it off, except for the bit the thickness of the wall. This then glues to the outside of the steps, although this picture doesn't seem to be of the model as actually shipped. There's a grey wall where the chimney should be. Or is this a partially monochrome image? In any case, here's my version, which seemed to work okay. Next, coping stones go on top of those walls. I used tweezers to place these. The final step of the assembly is to fit the plastic external stairway to the side building. Here's the plastic sprue as it comes. And here are the parts separated from the sprue. The 2 small posts with knobs on the end aren't used, so I don't know why they're there. The instructions suggest taping down the steps when gluing the railings in place. I was a bit dubious about this at first, but when I determined how fiddly the fit was, I decided that it was a good idea. I glued the first railing to the side of the steps with poly cement. I guess plastic parts are not really Metcalfe's thing. This assembly could have been improved by providing some sort of positive fitting grooves, as is usually done in quality plastic kits. As it was, the posts just had to be positioned and lined up by eye. Once the first railing was set in place, I taped the assembly the other way up and glued the second railing in place. I was a bit nervous as to whether the railings would come out parallel fitting them like that, but they more or less did. Finally, those steps need to be fitted up to the door of the side building. The instructions don't actually say anything about that, just providing this picture. I glued the steps in place with card glue, fitting the top step over the tab of the card platform. This seemed to hold in place quite well, and the steps looked quite reasonable, and came down to ground level nicely. Here's my model essentially complete. I checked the parts sheets to see if I'd missed any parts, and found this selection of company name boards, which weren't actually mentioned in the instructions at all. The picture on the packaging does show one of these boards fitted. I actually thought that the one shown in this picture was possibly the nicest, but just to be different I chose another one. But I did want to go with one that would contrast in colour against the grey wall. So here's my building finished off with that name board. I had placed the template for the footprint on my 00 tabletop. Now I went ahead, for the moment at least, and placed the building itself where I had the template. I suppose it doesn't exactly fit in with the vintage 00 buildings. But I think I'm going to leave it there for now, and I quite enjoy looking at it. I apologise for this video being so long-winded, but I hope those interested in this kit may find it useful.